Civilizations don't collapse from the outside. They collapse from the moment they decide the rules don't apply to them. You've been told the Book of Judges is ancient religious literature, a relic of desert mythology, or a collection of folklore for Bronze Age shepherds. Every framing of this text assumes a comfortable distance between you and what lives inside it. That distance is the first lie. What this book actually contains is a real-time autopsy of a functioning society as it eats itself alive, conducted with a clinical precision that no modern historian has managed to equal. And the most terrifying detail, the one that keeps getting skipped in every Sunday school version and every academic overview, is this. The nation didn't fall because its enemies were too powerful. It fell because it made one small, quiet, economically reasonable compromise, and then another, and then another. And the catastrophe that followed was as inevitable as a mathematical proof. This is not a story about ancient history. This is the blueprint. It begins not with a battle lost, but with a battle half won. The Israelite tribes have just crossed into Canaan following 4 decades in the wilderness. They carry a mandate, a military doctrine so severe it had its own name. The Hebrew term herem. He-rem. The word itself sounds like something being torn from the root, and that is exactly what it meant. Total, consecrated destruction. Not conquest, not assimilation. Eradication. The ideological infrastructure of the Canaanite city-states, their temples, their priests, their economic networks, their entire cosmological framework was to be purged with the efficiency of a quarantine protocol. The architects of this mandate understood something that modern epidemiologists call pathogen persistence. The tribes of Israel left enough of it alive. The decision wasn't reckless, it was practical. The Canaanite populations were useful. They knew the land, the crops, the trade routes. Subjugating them for forced labor made economic sense. It made so much sense that tribe after tribe along the coastal plains, the valleys, the fertile lowlands, chose exactly the same rational path. The tribe of Manasseh did not drive out the Canaanites of Megiddo. Instead, they put them to forced labor. Ephraim did the same in Gezer. Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, all of them. Each decision documented, each one understandable in isolation, and together they form the opening chapter of a horror story. Because what moved in with the Canaanite populations was not merely their labor, it was their entire cosmological operating system. Their localized fertility deities, Baal and Ashtaroth, were not abstract theological positions. They were the spiritual architecture of an agrarian economy. If you wanted your crops to grow, if you wanted your herds to multiply, if you wanted rain to fall at the right time, you participated in the local cultic rituals of the valley you lived in. It wasn't heresy. It was practical. It was what your neighbors did. It was what the woman who sold you grain at the market did, and she seemed to be doing just fine. The contamination was not ideological invasion. It was social osmosis. And the text records what every microbiologist knows. A pathogen that enters quietly, that doesn't trigger the immune response, that integrates into the host's daily routines, is the most lethal kind. By the 2nd chapter of Judges, the immune response has failed entirely. A generation arises that has no experiential memory of the covenant, of the wilderness, of any of it. They do not reject the old order, they simply don't recognize it. And that is a more complete form of erasure than any military conquest could have achieved. Here is where every standard reading of this text makes its crucial error. Scholars call what follows the Judges cycle. 5 repeating stages: apostasy, oppression, crying out for help, deliverance, rest, and then the cycle begins again. A loop, a wheel, something that spins but stays in place. That framing is precisely wrong. And understanding why it's wrong is understanding the mechanism of the entire collapse. The cycle is not a loop. It is a helix, a descending gyre. Each revolution of the pattern lands lower than the last, and the differences between iterations are not cosmetic. They are structural. Look at the length of the rest periods between crises. They shrink with each generation. Look at the character of the deliverers raised up in response to each crisis. They degrade. The first judge, Othniel, operates inside all 5 stages of the pattern with full integrity. His successor, Ehud, achieves deliverance through covert assassination and psychological deception. After Ehud comes Deborah, whose male military commander refuses to lead the army into battle without her present. After Deborah, Gideon, who demands not 1 but 2 separate miraculous signs before he will act, who murders fellow Israelites in a personal vendetta, who erects an object of worship that becomes a national snare. After Gideon, Abimelech, who does not function as a deliverer at all. He is simply a tyrant who fills the void where a deliverer should have stood. And crucially, notice what disappears. In the early cycles, the people cry out. They feel the weight of their condition. That cry is the signal, the proof that something in them still recognizes the distance between where they are and where they should be. By the later cycles, the crying out phase is simply absent from the text, not suppressed, absent. They have stopped feeling the gap. The capacity for moral distress has been fully metabolized by the culture they absorbed. There is a phrase the text returns to in its final chapters, like a refrain, like a funeral bell struck at irregular intervals through the dark. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Modern readers often hear that as libertarian paradise, as radical freedom, as the romantic image of a people unbound by law. That reading is catastrophically naive. In the context of ancient Near Eastern anthropology, in the context of what immediately follows and immediately precedes that phrase in the text, it is a clinical definition of hell. It does not describe freedom. It describes the complete structural collapse of objective truth. When the governing principle of a society is each individual's private moral calculus, empathy becomes optional. The strong consume the weak without consequence, and the word justice ceases to carry any referent in the real world. The law of the jungle does not feel like the law of the jungle to those living inside it. It feels like normal. It feels like Tuesday. That normalization is the true horror. The slow, unremarkable process by which a society loses its capacity to recognize its own degradation. Each compromise immunizes the host against the next compromise. Each iteration of the cycle lands them a little further from the original coordinates, with no marker on the ground to tell them how far they've traveled. And the deliverers they raise up, the judges who bear that burden, are themselves products of the same infected soil. Which means the thing that is supposed to arrest the collapse carries the collapse inside it. There is one name you need to remember before we go any further, because the next figure who rises in this story is not a prophet, not a warrior, not even a general. He is a left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin. He has 17 inches of sharpened iron strapped to the wrong thigh, and he has secured a private audience with the king who has oppressed his people for 18 years, on the pretext of delivering a message from God. The message he actually carries is something entirely different. Let me tell you exactly how a man murders a king and walks out of the palace without anyone noticing. And let me tell you why the God of this story is the one who sent him to do it. The standard reading of Ehud frames him as a hero, a plucky underdog, clever, resourceful, divinely appointed. That framing is comfortable and entirely wrong. What Ehud represents is something far more unsettling. the first indicator that the divine response to Israel's degradation is itself beginning to take on the character of that degradation. God does not send a prophet. He does not send a righteous general who wins on an open field. He sends a covert operative with a custom weapon hidden in an unexpected location to perform a grotesque close-quarters assassination in a private room. The instrument of deliverance has been calibrated to the moral temperature of the people it serves, and that calibration will only become more precise as the story accelerates downward. Ehud ben Gera, a Benjamite. The tribe of Benjamin was, throughout the ancient Near East, legendary for its elite fighters, specifically for warriors of extraordinary ambidexterity. The Hebrew phrase that describes Ehud's condition is iter yag yamino, which does not simply mean left-handed. It means bound in the right hand, restricted, constrained. Whether this was a congenital defect from birth or the product of deliberate, lifelong training that had effectively atrophied his dominant hand to cultivate an equally lethal offhand, the tactical implications were identical. In a world where every security protocol was engineered around the assumption of right-handed combatants, a left-handed operator was a systematic blind spot built into the architecture of every checkpoint on Earth. He forges his own weapon. That detail matters, and almost no one pauses on it. He does not carry a standard Israelite military blade. He fabricates a specialized double-edged dagger. The text specifies the length as a gomed, roughly 18 inches, short enough to be fully concealed beneath outer garments, but long enough to reach vital organs through substantial body mass. He straps it to his right thigh. Every royal guard on Earth patted down a visitor's left side, because that is where right-handed men draw from. The blade on the right thigh was invisible to a protocol that had never imagined it needed to exist. Consider the temperature inside the Moabite tribute hall. It would have been cool stone and packed heat simultaneously, the thick press of administrators and guards making the air dense and close, the smell of lamp oil and unwashed wool, and the particular metallic undertone that settles in rooms where wealth is counted and power is negotiated. Ehud enters with the Israelite delegation, the tribute paid, the ritual of subjugation completed. He watches the guards. He catalogues the sightlines, the timing of the rotations, the angle of the light through the corridor columns. Then he dismisses his own entourage at the carved idols near Gilgal and turns back, alone. To deliver, he says, a secret message, an oracle from the divine, for the king's ears only. The guards let him through. Of course they do. They had already searched him. And there is something else at work here, something that reveals more about power than any military analysis can. Powerful men desperately want to believe that God is speaking directly to them. Eglon, king of Moab, whose name is a deliberate textual cruelty, the name shares its root with the Hebrew word for heifer, for the fattened calf, rises from his throne when Ehud says he carries a word from God. He rises heavily, the text seems to imply, the labor of that movement significant. He sends away his personal attendants. He sits alone in his cool upper chamber. The room contracts. Ehud reaches across with his left hand to his right thigh, beneath the robe, and draws the dagger. Eglon rises again, perhaps in reverent posture for the divine oracle he believes is coming. What comes instead is an upward thrust into the exposed abdomen that drives the blade so deeply, with such precise biomechanical force, that the hilt follows the blade into the king's body. The text describes, with the detached exactitude of a medical record, what happens next. The hilt disappears into the fat, the blade penetrates the bowel, and the involuntary physiological consequence of a pierced intestine fills the locked chamber. Ehud does not panic. This is important. He does not run. He walks out through the colonnade calmly, unhurried, as though the oracle has been delivered. He locks the heavy doors of the upper chamber from the outside. The guards return. The doors are locked. This could mean only one thing. The king is relieving himself in private. The cultural weight of that assumption, the absolute prohibition against breaching the king's privacy in such a moment, holds them outside the chamber for so long that Ehud has not only crossed the perimeter, but has already crossed the Jordan, rallied the Israelite militia in the hill country of Ephraim, and cut off every Moabite crossing at the river below. By the time the guards finally breach the chamber and find what the locked doors had been protecting, 10,000 Moabite soldiers are dead at the Jordan fords. The campaign is over in a day. 80 years of peace follow. Now hold that peace for a moment, and notice what it conceals. Ehud is celebrated. His method is nowhere condemned in the text. In fact, the narrative presents his left-handedness not as a disability, not as a quirk, but as the specific mechanism of divine provision. God, apparently, designed this man's body to be undetectable to standard security protocol. The deception, the assassination, the weaponized assumption of religious deference, none of it registers as morally troubling within the text's own framework. Because at this stage in the descent, it isn't. Not yet. Ehud is still operating in service of something beyond himself. The murder is genuinely political, not personal. The Israelites are genuinely oppressed. The calculation still has reference outside the self. But watch what happens to those references as the generations pass. Watch what happens when the next deliverer, and the one after that, applies the same logic of the necessary exception, the justified deception, the ends and means calculus, but applies it to targets that are not Moabite kings. Watch what happens when it is applied inward. Because the next figure is not fighting a foreign oppressor. The next figure is a woman waiting alone in a tent, and the man she is about to kill is a general who believes he is safe. And what she does with a tent peg and a mallet will shatter a sacred covenant that, in the ancient world, no one had ever dared to violate. Not until then. Here is what gets left out of every painting, every children's Bible, every sanitized retelling of what Jael did. The horror of it is not the violence. The horror is the intimacy. The horror is that she made him feel completely safe first. The Battle of Kishon has just broken the Canaanite military machine. Deborah, the prophetess who served as judge over Israel from beneath a palm tree in the hill country of Ephraim, has guided General Barak down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men, and the army of Sisera, the Canaanite military commander who wielded 900 iron chariots against a people who had no iron at all, has been routed. The chariots, the symbol of Canaanite technological supremacy that had kept the Israelite tribes pressed into the highlands for 20 years, are useless in the Kishon Valley floodwaters. The army scatters, and Sisera, the most feared warlord in the region, runs on foot. He runs toward what he believes is safety, the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. The Kenites are a nomadic tribe, metal workers, historically allied with neither Israelite nor Canaanite, neutral by political necessity. Heber's clan specifically is at peace with the Canaanite king Jabin. Sisera knows this. To a pursued man, a neutral tent is a sanctuary. And the woman standing at the entrance to that tent, going out actively to meet him, calling to him, "Turn aside, my lord, do not fear," is the guarantee of that sanctuary made flesh. He enters. She covers him with a thick blanket, a heavy rug, the kind used in nomadic camps, wool that smells of lanolin and fire smoke, and the particular animal warmth that makes enclosed spaces feel like protection. He asks for water. She does not give him water. She opens a skin of goat's milk and gives him that instead. Warm, rich goat's milk, after flight, after terror, after the catastrophic collapse of everything he had commanded that morning. The casein proteins in warm milk interact with the body's adenosine receptors. The sedative effect is mild but measurable. A man already depleted by adrenaline crash, already wrapped in heavy wool in a dim, enclosed, warm space, drinking warm milk from the hands of a woman who has told him he is safe. He becomes, within minutes, physiologically incapable of vigilance. She tucks him in. She stands guard at the entrance. He says, "If anyone asks, there is no one here." She says, "Do not be afraid." He sleeps. Now understand what Jael has created in that tent. She has constructed a maternal architecture with extraordinary deliberateness. The covering, the milk, the soft assurance, the standing guard. These are the precise components of maternal protection applied to a warlord who has spent 20 years commanding the most technologically advanced army in the region. She has not simply deceived him. She has infantilized him. She has reached past every warrior reflex, every survival instinct, every protocol that kept Sisera alive in a world designed to kill him, and replaced them all with the one vulnerability that no armor covers: the body's cellular memory of safety, of warmth, of a voice that says, "Do not be afraid." Then she reaches for her tools. A yatid, a tent peg. Among nomadic tribes, the division of domestic labor assigned the erection and dismantling of tents exclusively to women. Jael had driven tent pegs into hard ground in every season, in every condition, for her entire adult life. She knew exactly how much force it took. She knew the angle of entry. She knew the sound the mallet made when the peg hit resistance and when it had cleared it. These were not unfamiliar tools. They were the most familiar objects in her world. She moves to where he sleeps with the footstep calibration of someone who has crossed a tent floor 1,000 times without waking a child. She positions herself, one hand on the peg, one hand on the mallet. She does not hesitate, because hesitation in this specific moment, this breach of the hospitality covenant that was as foundational to Near Eastern survival as water, requires a will that has already made its decision before the body acts. She has already decided. The blow is catastrophic and singular. The peg goes through his temple and into the ground beneath him. Pinned. The text uses a word that means he writhed, then died, with a specificity that suggests the blow was not immediately fatal, that there were seconds of convulsive response before the cerebral damage completed its work. He does not cry out. He cannot. When Barak arrives in pursuit, still looking for the man who escaped the field, Jael steps out of the tent entrance with the casual posture of someone who has nothing to hide and says, "Come, and I will show you the man you seek." She does not explain. She simply steps aside, and there, behind her, in the filtered light of the tent interior, is the most feared general in Canaan, pinned to the ground like a specimen. Here is what the text does with this moment, and it is one of the most structurally audacious choices in the entire document. It does not condemn her. Deborah's victory song in the following chapter explicitly celebrates Jael, calls her most blessed of women, and describes the murder in verse with aesthetic delight. The tent peg driving, his head falling, his feet collapsing, with the repetitive, slowing rhythm of a man dying in installments. The text exults in it. What does that mean? It means the moral framework of the text at this stage is still coherent enough to recognize the outcome as genuinely good, but has already corroded enough that it cannot recognize what was destroyed in producing it. The hospitality covenant was not a social nicety. It was the operating system of survival in a world without fixed infrastructure. To shatter it in the service of a just outcome was to establish a precedent that sacred covenants are negotiable when the cause is sufficient. That when the right people win, the method does not need to be interrogated. Watch that precedent. It will appear again, in a different tent, with different tools, and a cause that everyone involved will believe is entirely just. The next figure does not even bother with justice. He begins with the money. 70 pieces of silver, drawn from the treasury of a god whose name translates to Lord of the Covenant. He uses it to hire men who are described in the Hebrew text as worthless and reckless, and with those men, he takes 70 of his brothers to a single stone, and he does what he considers necessary. His name is Abimelech, and the parable that is about to be delivered from a mountaintop, the parable of the thornbush king, is the most precise political prophecy you have never heard of. Power vacuums don't stay empty. They fill, and what fills them almost never resembles what was lost. Gideon is dead. The man who drove off the Midianites with 300 soldiers, torches, and clay jars is gone, and the vacuum he leaves behind is not merely political, it is spiritual, structural, psychological. Gideon himself refused the formal offer of kingship from the Israelites after his victory. "I will not rule over you," he said, "and neither will my son. The Lord will rule over you." A righteous statement, apparently, except that by the time he died, Gideon had accumulated 70 sons from numerous wives and one concubine in Shechem. He had built a golden ephod that the entire nation began to worship as an idol. He had murdered the elders of Sukkoth, mutilating them with desert thorns. The man who refused the crown of a king had been, in every functional sense, a king. He had simply refused the accountability that comes with the title. His son understood something about power that Gideon never fully admitted, that the gap between refusing the title and seizing it is not a moral position, it is just a gap, and gaps can be stepped into. Abimelech's mother is the Shechemite concubine, which means he is half Canaanite by blood and entirely Canaanite by cultural formation. Raised in Shechem, educated in its power dynamics, fluent in its rhetorical codes. He goes to his mother's relatives and frames his ambition as their common interest. "Remember that I am your bone and your flesh." You don't want to serve 70 men, all those legitimate sons of the great Gideon. Wouldn't you rather have one man, your kinsman? The argument is ancient and immediately recognizable. It is the rhetoric of tribal consolidation, the promise that in-group unity against a shared external threat is worth any cost. It is the oldest political manipulation on earth, and it works within the hour. The money they give him comes from the temple of Baal-berith. Baal-berith, Lord of the Covenant. 70 shekels of silver, pulled from the treasury of the deity whose name means covenant, used to fund the destruction of an actual covenant. The irony is so dense it feels intentional, a structural joke embedded by the author to mark the absolute moral bankruptcy of every party in the transaction. The silver goes to hire what the Hebrew text calls anashim rakim ufohazim, worthless and reckless men. Not warriors, not soldiers with allegiances or professional codes, hired violence, untethered to anything but payment. With those men, Abimelech goes to Ophrah, where his 70 brothers live. He gathers them to a single stone in the city center, and he kills them on it, one by one in sequence against the same surface. The text does not spare the reader the arithmetic: 70 men, 1 stone. The specificity of the location is not incidental. The phrase, "upon one stone," suggests an organized execution, a methodical process, not a chaotic massacre. Archaeological excavations at Tel Balata, the ancient site of Shechem, have uncovered the remains of a Migdal temple, a fortress temple featuring a massive, squared foundation stone in its central courtyard, precisely consistent with what the text describes. This was not butchery in the wilderness. It was a public spectacle, performed on architectural infrastructure, conducted with the logic of a man who understood that power requires a founding act of such visible, indelible terror that it never needs to be repeated. The youngest brother, Jotham, escapes by hiding. When the coronation of Abimelech is announced at Shechem, Jotham climbs to the summit of Mount Gerizim, the mountain of blessing in Israelite theology, and delivers a fable. It is the most sophisticated piece of political satire in the ancient world, and it has never received the attention it deserves. The trees of the forest seek to anoint a king. They approach the olive tree first. The olive refuses. Shall I stop producing my oil, which honors God and humans, merely to hold sway over the trees? They approach the fig tree. The fig refuses. Shall I abandon my sweetness and my fruit merely to rule over the trees? They approach the vine. The vine refuses. Shall I give up my wine, which gladdens the hearts of God and mortals, to go and wave over the trees? Then they approach the bramble. The Hebrew word is atad, the common bramble or buckthorn, a low-growing, thorned weed that spreads across abandoned agricultural land. It produces nothing. Its shallow roots cannot compete with established plants for water. Its main ecological contribution is that it burns. It is extraordinarily flammable, and it accepts the crown without hesitation. "Come and take refuge in my shade," it says, "but if not, let fire come out of the bramble and consume the cedars of Lebanon." The philosophical architecture of that parable is devastating and deserves to be read as the political theory it is. The productive members of a society, those who generate value, create sustenance, contribute to communal welfare, will refuse the administrative burden of leadership because leadership costs them their productivity. The refusal is not cowardice. It is the rational decision of anyone who has something real to lose. Leadership, when offered to the capable, is a sacrifice of the thing that makes them capable. The vacuum that creates is real. It is not filled by a second-best productive member. It is filled by the atad, the bramble, the entity with nothing to sacrifice because it produces nothing in the first place. The bramble does not lead through the creation of value. It leads through the threat of destruction. "Come under my shade," which I cannot actually provide because I am a thorned weed a foot off the ground. "Submit to me, or I will burn everything." That is the only offer available when the productive refuse to lead. Abimelech rules for 3 years. His reign is a single, unbroken demonstration of the bramble's governing logic. Not wealth creation, not security, not justice, just the maintenance of terror as a substitute for authority. The Shechemites who funded his rise eventually conspire against him. He destroys their city, levels it, sows it with salt. He attacks the city of Thebez. The people retreat into a fortified tower. He advances on the tower door to set it on fire, the bramble's one consistent tool, and a woman standing on the wall above him drops a millstone onto his skull. It fractures his cranium. He is dying on the ground, and his last act, the very last moment of his consciousness, is a command to his armor-bearer. "Run me through with your sword, so that men may not say a woman killed me." Even in the moment of death, the tyrant's primary concern is the management of the narrative. Abimelech died of a fractured skull on a dirt street below a tower in Thebez. Jotham's prophecy had said the fire from the bramble would consume those who empowered it, and so it did. The citizens of Shechem, who handed him 70 shekels of blood money from a god of covenants, were burned in their own fortress temple when Abimelech set it alight with them inside. The bramble burned, and it took with it everything within reach. 3 years. That is how long it takes, in this text's accounting, For a society that has abandoned the capacity to produce leadership from its most capable members, to generate and then be consumed by the worst version of itself. But Abimelech, for all his horror, is still recognizable as human. What comes at the end of this story is something different. What comes at the end is not a tyrant with grandiose ambitions and theatrical violence. What comes at the end is a Levite with a knife and a very methodical mind. And what he does with both will require you to confront a possibility that the text seems to have been structured specifically to make unavoidable. That the most monstrous act in the entire book of Judges is not committed by a foreign oppressor. It is committed by a member of the priestly class, against a woman who was already in his custody. And it is committed with the same precise, deliberate technique he learned in the temple. The last story in the book of Judges begins in Bethlehem, in the hill country of Judah. A Levite man travels from the remote highlands of Ephraim to retrieve his concubine, a woman who has left him and returned to her father's house. The Hebrew text describes his motivation with a phrase that is both intimate and opaque, suggesting he intended to speak tenderly to her. Whether this was genuine affection or the transactional diplomacy of a man recovering a piece of property is a question the text refuses to answer. It simply says he went. He went with his donkey and a servant, and the narrative takes us with him into a world that is about to reveal exactly what 300 years of descent looks like when it reaches the bottom. The father-in-law is generous, perhaps overly so. He detains the Levite day after day, extending the visit with food and wine and the hospitality of someone who is not quite ready to release his daughter. On the 5th day, the Levite insists on leaving in the late afternoon. This is a detail that matters, an afternoon departure that guarantees they will need to stop before reaching home. They reach Jebus, the Canaanite city that will one day be Jerusalem. But the Levite refuses to stop there because it is a city of foreigners. He prefers to continue to Gibeah, an Israelite city, controlled by the tribe of Benjamin. In Israel, he says, we will be safe. The logic of that choice, and what it produces, is the central argument of the final movement of this book. They arrive at Gibeah's public square at dusk and sit, waiting for someone to offer them shelter, as the hospitality customs of the ancient world required. No one comes. The city moves around them in the gathering dark. Finally, an old man returning from work in the fields, himself originally from Ephraim and therefore also a foreigner in Benjamin's city, sees them and brings them home. He provides food, water, fodder for the donkeys. He gives them shelter. The hospitality that the city of Gibeah refuses to extend, a foreigner within it extends on its behalf. Then the men of the city come. The text uses language here that is pulled almost verbatim from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. The parallel is deliberate, constructed with embedded syntactical markers that any reader of the Hebrew would have recognized immediately. The men surround the house. They beat on the door. They demand the Levite be sent out to them so they can sexually assault him. And the old man goes to the door, and the language of his offer mirrors Lot's language at Sodom almost word for word. Here are my daughter and this man's concubine. Abuse them. Do what seems good to you to them. But to this man, do not do this vile thing. The parallel is not a literary coincidence. The author is making a precise theological statement. Gibeah, an Israelite city, a city of the tribe of Benjamin, has become Sodom. The infection is complete. The Canaanite pathogen that entered the national bloodstream 3 centuries earlier has fully expressed itself in the behavior of Yahweh's own people. What happens next is described in 3 verses, and those 3 verses represent the most compressed horror in the entire Hebrew Bible. The Levite seizes his concubine and thrusts her out the door into the mob. He does not go out himself. He does not attempt to negotiate, to reason, to offer himself in her place. He simply reaches out in the darkness of the threshold, takes hold of the woman he traveled 4 days to retrieve with tender words, and pushes her through the door. The sound the door makes when he closes it behind her is the sound of the Book of Judges sealing its own indictment. The text says she was abused all through the night until the morning. Then she fell at the door of the house, her hands on the threshold, and lay there until it was light. The position of her hands matters and should never be glossed over. She fell reaching for the door the Levite had closed from the inside. She died with her hands on the threshold of the shelter that was supposed to protect her, that she had crawled back to in the dark. When the Levite opens the door in the morning, he says, "Get up, let us be going," as though she is sleeping, as though the night outside was merely unpleasant, and now the journey must resume. When she does not answer, there is no recorded grief, no cry. The text moves with the same detached, procedural rhythm as the Levite himself. He loads her body onto a donkey. He goes home. Then he takes a knife. The Hebrew verb used for what he does next is nita. It appears throughout the Torah in Leviticus in the descriptions of the sacrificial protocols at the altar of Yahweh, the precise ritualistic dismemberment of animal offerings. How the priest cuts them into their pieces, joint from joint, in the specific anatomical sequence the sacred law requires. The Levite, who is himself a Levite, a member of the priestly tribe, performs this same operation on the body of his concubine. He cuts her into 12 pieces with the methodical, experienced precision of a temple functionary who has performed this technique 1,000 times on the altar. Bone from joint, separated, sent. 1 piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. It is a stroke of grotesque political genius. He has weaponized the atrocity. He has transformed himself from perpetrator to messenger, from the man who threw her out the door to the man outraged enough by what happened to her to demand national justice. And it works. The nation assembles. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. The text says, "Such a thing has never happened nor been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt." They are right. Nothing like this has happened. But the reason nothing like this has happened before is that the degradation required to produce both the crime and its monstrous aftermath was not yet fully assembled. Now it is. The Levite delivers his account to the assembled tribes. He says, "The men of Gibeah rose against me." He says, "They meant to kill me." He omits everything else. He omits the door. He omits the hands on the threshold. He omits the morning command, "Get up." And the assembled nation, armed with righteous fury and 12 anatomical pieces of evidence, marches on Benjamin and nearly destroys the entire tribe. 40,000 Israelite soldiers die in the campaign. The tribe of Benjamin is reduced to 600 surviving men hiding in the wilderness. Then comes the last, terrible decision. The tribes have sworn not to give their daughters to Benjamin in marriage. They realize they have effectively scheduled an entire tribe for extinction. So they do the math. They need wives for 600 men. They find that the city of Jabesh-Gilead failed to send representatives to the assembly before the war. They march to Jabesh-Gilead, kill every man and every woman who is not a virgin, and bring back 400 virgins. 200 short. So the elders of Israel go to the remaining Benjaminites hiding in the wilderness, and they say, "Go to the festival of the Lord at Shiloh. Hide in the vineyards. When the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance, each man come out from the vineyards and seize his wife from the daughters of Shiloh." The leaders of Israel, the authorities charged with upholding the covenant law, officially sanctioned the mass kidnapping of women from a religious festival. They framed the abduction as the solution to a civil war caused by a gang assault on a woman caused by a man who threw her out a door to save himself. And the whole structure, the entire cascading catastrophe from the first moment Gibeah's men surrounded that house, traces back through 3 centuries of quiet compromise, of half-executed mandates, of acceptable exceptions, of everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. The Book of Judges does not end with a resolution. It simply stops, suspended over the void it has so meticulously, so clinically, so mercilessly documented. There is no redemption arc. There is no moral delivered by the narrator standing at a safe remove from the material. There is just the last image. Women being dragged from a vineyard at a religious festival, by men the state has officially instructed to seize them, while the elders who gave the instruction tell the fathers of those women not to be angry, because, technically, no one broke an oath. Here is the irony the book has been building to for 21 chapters, the structural irony that changes what all of it means. The nation of Israel abandoned the harem not because they were cruel, but because they were reasonable. They saw value in the Canaanite populations. They made the humane choice, the economically sensible choice, the choice that cost nothing in the immediate moment. And that one act of practical mercy, repeated enough times, produced a culture so thoroughly colonized by the values it had failed to quarantine that it eventually did to itself what it had refused to do to its enemies. The thing Israel would not destroy absorbed Israel and wore its face. The thing Israel spent centuries trying to become, Canaan, was what Israel was by the end. The mercy was the mechanism of the collapse. And here is what cuts closest to the bone. The question you have been sitting with since the first story and will carry out of this video whether you choose to or not. The Levite's concubine had a name. The text never gives it to us. Every other figure in this book, the judges, the kings, the assassins, the prophetesses, even the tyrants, gets a name. She does not. She is described entirely in relation to him, his concubine, his Pilegesh, her father's daughter. The text that documents the anatomy of an entire civilization's collapse cannot find space for the name of the woman whose death becomes the catalyst for the final, catastrophic event. Which means the question the Book of Judges leaves you with is not about ancient Israel. It is about the ledger kept by every society for every person rendered invisible by the stories that civilization tells about itself. If Jotham was right, and the bramble always rises when the capable refuse the burden of leadership, and if the Levite was wrong, not in what he claimed, but in what he concealed, then what do you do with the knowledge that the most dangerous actor in a collapsing society is not the tyrant everyone can see, but the credible witness who controls the narrative of what happened? That question has been active in the world since the day this text was written. And the next thread it pulls on, the one you haven't been told about yet, is the story of the woman who appears in the chapter immediately following the last page of Judges. The story of what happens to the kingdom that Judges said the people were ready for. The kingdom that inherited every lesson Judges refused to resolve. You have already been standing inside that story for the last hour. You just didn't know it yet.